Hello, my name is Sneed Collard, or as it says on my books, Sneed B. Collard III, and I am the author of more than 85 books for young people. They include science books such as Catching Air, Taking the Leap with Gliding Animals. They include A Platypus Probably. Books like Woodpeckers, Drilling Holes and Bagging Bugs, and even mystery adventure novels like The Governor's Dog is Missing. Today, though, I want to visit with you because I know a lot of you are stuck at home like I am because of this thing called the coronavirus. Now, this thing is a drag. There's no doubt about it. But that is no excuse for us to quit learning about this amazing planet we all live on. And I thought one way that I could help make it easier for you would be to share an author talk that I usually give only when I visit schools around the country. The topic of today's talk is how do you generate writing ideas from your life experience? And as you probably talked about in the classroom, there are a lot of ways to do that. You can read books. That's one great way to get great writing ideas. You can ask your friends or just watch the weird things that they're doing. Sometimes my kids come up to me and say, hey, Daddy, it would be great to write a book about this or that. But I gotta tell you, one of my favorite ways to get great writing ideas is to have adventure and then write about the things that I see on my adventures. And to show you what I mean today, I would like to take all of you on an adventure with me to a place called the Galapagos Islands. Now raise your hands if you've ever been to the Galapagos. Okay, put your hands down because I can't see them anyway. But the Galapagos Islands are located a long way from, well, almost anywhere. We make our home up in Missoula, Montana. The Galapagos are located on the equator, thousands of miles away. And it took us a really long time to get there, especially because my horse was really slow. But seriously, we had to fly from Missoula, Montana, to Minneapolis, Minnesota, down to Miami, then take another plane to Ecuador, and finally head out to the Galapagos, where we landed on a tiny island called Baltra. We jumped into a shuttle bus that took us down to what would be our home for the next week, a ship called the National Geographic Explorer. We settled into our bunks. Here's my son Braden and daughter Tessa, and within an hour or two, we were having our first Galapagos adventure. Now, the plan for the next week was to basically travel around and see as many of the Galapagos Islands as possible. There are more than 20 islands, all formed by volcanoes, but each one is different and has its own different group of animals. We first set out in a Zodiac that shuttled us to the beach of the nearest island, and right away I started learning amazing things about the Galapagos. One is that the animals there are very tame. This is a yellow warbler, which is really hard to see around my home in Montana, and maybe where you live also. Down the Galapagos, these birds are hopping around your feet on the beach. And they're not the only tame animals. Sea lions walk up to you. Sea turtles swim right nearby you. Now, why are these animals so tame? Well, most likely because they have evolved without having a bunch of predators around, including humans, who can eat them. And so this tameness is something we found with almost all of the animals down there. Now, speaking of sea turtles, the Galapagos happen to be a really good place if you're a reptile. Why? Because they tend to be hot and dry. This doesn't mean that a lot of reptiles have made it to the Galapagos. Here are one kind of lizard that has. It's called a lava lizard, and I got to watch these guys kind of battle it out over territory in the hot lava rocks. But even more interesting than those lava lizards are two very large lizards called iguanas. This is the Galapagos land iguana. You often find it guarding a patch of cactuses here. Why? Because that's an emergency food supply for them. They can bite off these spiny leaves and just grind them up and spit out the spines. An even more interesting kind of iguana, though, is an animal called the Galapagos marine iguana. Now, Galapagos marine iguanas are the only lizards on Earth that actually dive underwater to feed on underwater plants. When I was snorkeling, I got to watch them do that. The iguanas, though, have a problem. Ask yourself, you heard that the Galapagos Islands sit on the equator. Do you think the waters there are warm or cold? Actually, they're quite chilly. Why? Because Antarctic waters sink down in Antarctica and they creep along the bottom of the ocean until they hit the Galapagos Islands and they are forced upward. This is called upwelling, and these cool waters have led to an abundance of marine life. The iguanas, though, of course, are cold-blooded. They depend on the sun for their energy to warm up. And so they can only stay in the water, underwater, for about 20 minutes at a time. Then they have to climb back onto those hot lava rocks and warm up again. Of course, there weren't just reptiles in the Galapagos. There are lots of birds. This is a beautiful gull called a swallow-tailed gull. Here's a Galapagos dove that made its nest right in one of these prickly pear cactuses. Probably the most famous bird of the Galapagos is something called do you know what it is? That's right, a blue-footed booby. And our second day on the islands, we got to go to an island that was a nesting site for the blue-footed boobies and other birds. Now, blue-footed boobies are especially famous for their bright blue feet. These bright blue feet are a signal to other boobies that shows the other birds how healthy they are. The brighter your feet means that you've been getting more better food. And that means you're healthier, which can come in handy to know when you're choosing another bird to mate with. Now, speaking of food, what do you think blue-footed boobies eat? If you guess fish, well, guess what? You're wrong. Blue-footed boobies actually eat tourists. They find a nice couple like this walking on the beach, and they dive down to attack them and tear the flesh from their bones. It's horrifying. Just kidding. Actually, blue-footed boobies do eat fish. They dive straight down into the water, where they feed on huge schools of little fish like anchovies and things like that. But the blue-footed boobies weren't the only animals nesting on the island. Another great bird that the Galapagos has are these frigate birds. And these are very interesting birds for a lot of reasons. The males build these stick nests, and then they sit in them and they wait till a female flies over. Then all of the males they spread out their wings and start making noise and tapping their beaks against that big red gular pouch that they poof out in the hopes that one of these females will choose them. And sometimes at least it works. In fact, while we watched these three, a female landed next to one of them to pair off for mating. Interestingly, some of the most fascinating birds in the Galapagos aren't the big blue-footed boobies or frigate birds. They're tiny little birds called finches. In fact, one day while we were in the Galapagos, we ran into this guy named, what was his name? I think it was Chuck or Charles Darwin, something like that. And he told us this amazing story about the Galapagos finches. Now, Charles Darwin lived back in the 1800s, and at that time, people had no idea how new species form. They were getting the idea that evolution did take place. They were digging up dinosaur bones and saying, these aren't here anymore. They must have turned into something else, but nobody knew how that happened. Well, as a young man, in 1831, at the age of 22, Darwin got on board a scientific vessel called the Beagle, and they embarked on a 5-year trip around the world. Darwin was the chief scientist for this trip, and everywhere he went, he collected animals and plants and took notes about what he saw. During this time, especially when he got to the Galapagos, he began thinking about evolution and how it happened. Why? Because he'd got to the Galapagos and he'd see things like mockingbirds, and they all looked very similar, but they did different things. And in fact, there were about 4 different kinds. And he thought, did they all come from one species? Same thing with the tortoises. There were about a dozen different tortoises, and they were all different on different islands. Some of them had nice rounded shells. Some of them had saddle-shaped shells, flat shells like that. And that also got him thinking. But it was the finches more than anything that led him to the breakthrough. He collected a bunch of these finches, and when he got back to the British Museum in London, he turned them over to his chief bird guy there. And the bird guy came back and he said, you have more than a dozen different species of finches here. Did you know that? Darwin was astonished. And he began thinking about it, and he realized, wow, some of these finches, they all kind of look the same, but some have small beaks for eating small seeds. Others have big honking beaks for eating giant seeds. Some of them even seemed adapted to drinking Coca-Cola. And he began thinking about this, how this could happen. And it took him about 30 years to put all his ideas together. Finally, he wrote a book called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. He didn't invent the idea of evolution. What he came up with was how it happened, which is natural selection. And the idea in a nutshell is that all of us are a little bit different. And depending on our circumstances, some of our differences are going to be a benefit, some are going to be harmful. But over time, those benefits can make us more successful, have more children, so that those benefits are passed on to other generations through their genetic material. Eventually, you end up with big differences that turn into different species. This book, The Origin of Species, totally changed how we think about our world. In fact, Darwin is so famous that they have created a Darwin research station down in the Galapagos named after him. The scientists there, they continue to study Galapagos animals, but they also continue to study how to protect these animals. Like everywhere else in the world, Galapagos animals have some threats. One of them is invasive species, plants and animals that are brought to the Galapagos that don't belong and harm the native animals. This is called a smooth-billed Annie. They attack the eggs and sometimes the chicks of other native birds. Cats are a huge problem, not only in the Galapagos, but worldwide, where they devour billions of native birds. And in the Galapagos, they can even eat marine iguanas. Scientists are also concerned about climate change. Remember, I told you how the waters around the Galapagos are very cool? Well, during events called El Nino, warm waters replace the cooler waters. The green algae that the marine iguanas eat dies and is replaced by red algae that the iguanas can't digest. So many of the iguanas end up dying. Fortunately, the cooler waters come back to the Galapagos and the green algae starts growing again. But scientists are concerned that as our planet's temperatures keep warming up, El Nino may happen more often, posing a threat to the marine iguanas and many other animals. Unfortunately, our time in the Galapagos quickly drew to a close. Our last day there, Zodiac boats loaded us up and shuttled us to the second of the Galapagos airports. We got on our plane and we flew home again. I hope that you all enjoyed that adventure to the Galapagos. For a writer, though, a question becomes, how do I turn that experience, whether it's a trip to the Galapagos, a walk in the park, a birthday party, anything else, into a story to write about? Well, there's several things you have to think about. One, who is my audience for this story? Am I going to tell it to my friends? Am I writing a report for my teacher? Am I going to write an article for the school newspaper? For me, I'm going to write a book. So I'm trying to think, okay, what would make a good story from the Galapagos for the book? And a key in this process to selecting my best idea is to narrow things down from big to small. What do I mean with the Galapagos? Let's use that as an example. I mean, obviously, our idea for this project is the Galapagos, but that's a huge topic, way too big to cover in a single book. So I'm going to think, how can I narrow that down? And a good thing to think about when you're narrowing it down is what interests me about this. Well, for me, you can probably guess what interests me the most about the Galapagos. That is the animals that live there. But even the animals of the Galapagos is a huge topic. I mean, we talked about birds, fish, tortoises, all kinds of things. So I still have to narrow things down a little bit more. What's my next level? Well, one of my favorite groups of animals, probably ever, is a group of animals called reptiles. And so I'm thinking, what could I write about the reptiles of the Galapagos? But is that still a pretty big topic? You bet. We saw tortoises, we saw lizards, no snakes, unfortunately, but we also saw turtles. So I'm going to have to think even harder to narrow things down. And what I came up with that I would like to write about, can anyone guess what that might be? The iguanas, right? I thought the iguanas were fascinating. So now I've got my topic, right? I've narrowed it down, but could I narrow it a little bit more? Yeah, how am I going to approach this? Well, one of the things that fascinated me about these iguanas is how they got to the Galapagos in the first place, but also how they evolved into the special animals that they are today. So no matter what the experience is that you're writing about, even if it's a hobby or something else, you can use this method, this process, to help you narrow down your ideas into the best possible story for the size and the audience that you're writing about. We saw that with our Galapagos example. I started out with a really big idea, the Galapagos, way too big to write about. But I thought, let's narrow it down to animals. Still decided that's too big to write about. Went down even further to reptiles till finally we landed on iguanas. But even when you have your subject that you want to write about, you may find a particular story that interests you more than any other and that may interest your audience. For our example, we found the story of how the iguanas got there and how they evolved. I was very fortunate, though, to pick this particular topic because it turns out that a scientist had recently been doing more research on these two iguana species. Not only had she confirmed that both of these lizards evolved from the same ancestor, a lizard that accidentally floated to the Galapagos about 10 million years ago, but she established that the two species probably split into different species about 5 million years ago. And so naturally, when I heard this story, I thought that would make a great book. And I wrote it up, and it turned into a book called One Iguana, Two Iguanas, which I hope that all of you will enjoy. And it's an interesting book because not only am I giving information, I'm telling a story. And so I hope that this whole process has stimulated you guys to learn to tell your own stories. Take an adventure or an experience that you've had and shaped it down into something that would make a nice, neat story that you can write about or tell your friends or anything else you want to do with it. Teachers and librarians, as much fun as we've had during this virtual author visit today, it's way more fun to invite me to your school in person. To find out more about my extensive offerings of assembly presentations, hands-on writing workshops, and teacher professional development seminars, please check out my website at www.sneedbcollarthe3rd.com, where you can also find my email address for how to contact me. Students and children, please do not contact me directly yourselves. You may contact me through your parents or through your teachers, and I hope all of you will follow my sons and my birding adventures on fathersonbirding.com. With that, I want to thank all of you for spending some time with me today. I know we're going through some pretty rough times right now, but we're all going to get through them together. Just remember to each and every day do something nice for somebody else, and more than anything, to keep learning new things. To wrap up, I want to introduce you to one very special guest who sets a great example of the attitude that we all need right now to stay happy and healthy. And that is my dog, Lola. So here is Lola. Let's see, where are you, Lola? Oh, good dog, good dog. So can you see her there on the screen? And Lola is a black lab, a rescue dog we got from the Humane Society. And she is just a wonderful dog. And she wants to wish all of you the very best. And because of that, I will give you all a treat. Give her a treat, rather, on your behalf. Here you go. Up, 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 up. Good dog, Lola. All right, everybody. Take care of yourselves and keep learning.